Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt, so nice to be with you once again after the feedback we've gotten for our discussion before Maseches Rosh Hashanah. Although we're a couple of days late, but we have to do it again for Maseches Taanis. People want it longer, more expansive. We're going to keep it short, and maybe one day we'll be able to do something more expansive. So let's begin Maseches Taanis. Rabbi Brodt, give us a little bit of an introduction.
Okay, so Maseches Taanis is a very Geschmack Masechta, talks a lot about the word Taanis. It means all aspects of Taanis, with even halacha l'maisa aspects. Some aspects we'll get to very quickly at the end. And like all other Masechtas, just to mention one tool is the Girsais, the text of the Talmud of Masechtas Taanis. So up till now, the one main tool would be the Dikduke Seforim. Mashal, if someone uses Art Scroll Hebrew a lot, you'll notice it quoted extensively in the footnotes, not so much in the English. It's an interesting difference between the two. And later, after the Dikduke Seforim wrote his work, there was an edition from Tzvi Molter, famous for working on a book of his they wrote on Sadiga and others. And this work is based on many manuscripts of Masechtas Taanis that were not available to the Dikduke Seforim. This Masechtas Taanis is available, I believe, on Eitzar Chachma. Since then, there's been much more. There's been many more discoveries with the Girsais, the Gemara, but that's beyond the scope. Okay, that's the first tool to know about on the Masechta.
Very good. Okay, so the first thing let's discuss is Rashi. I know there's been discussion in the previous generations among the Achronim if this is Rashi, if this is not Rashi. I know I've heard being discussed. The Chidah talks about it in Shem Agdalim. Maratzchias, I know, both on the Masechta and in his Truvas talks about it. So, Rabbi Eliezer, what can you say about Rashi on Masechtas Taanis?
Okay, so interesting is, in general, it's very interesting, is that certain Masechtas on Shas, it's been questioned if it's where we have different Messiahs that say that this Masechta is not Rashi, or this part of the Masechta is not Rashi. One such Masechta is Rashi on Taanis. The question is, who was the first person who even pointed this out? Also, I'll try to explain what the significance of knowing if it's Rashi or not, and possibly, if it's not Rashi, who it is. So first, I looked into it a few different times, and I have written down in my notes that there is a Rabbi Yaakov Emden about the subject. So, but I looked high and low, and I could not find the Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Finally, okay, looking, and then I see the Chidah brings Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and he says, in the Shem Agdalim, he says that Rabbi Yaakov Emden says in his Mishnah Lechem that Rashi on Masechtas Taanis is not Rashi. Okay, fine. So but I want to see. Everyone knows the famous klal oisiyos machkimiyos. It's always to check up things inside. I want to see where is this Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Anyway, I look up the Mishnah Lechem. Now, the Mishnah Lechem is Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote a Peirushim Mishnah. It's called Lechem Shamayim, and he added additions. And later on, it was printed called Mishnah Lechem. So I open up my Mishnah Lechem. There's nothing on Taanis, and I cannot find it. Again, looking high and low, looking all over different places. People quote it from different places, but it seems no one really saw it where it is. Finally, it's getting very frustrating. I want to see this Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and the reason is as follows. We always want to know who's the first person who claimed that it's not Rashi, and what's his reasoning behind it. Maybe, it could help us understand what, to dismiss that it's Rashi so fast. It's Rashi. Anyway, make a long story short, without boring you all the steps of the hunt, there's a sefer. There was a person named Chaim Michal. He had a fascinating, massive library of manuscripts of Seforim. He dies in the late 1840s. And he had a catalog where he would list different information that he found about Seforim or his manuscripts, and later on it was printed. There he brings that Rabbi Yaakov Emden talks about it in Mishnah Lechem. So I told you, but I looked at my Mishnah Lechem, it's not there. Turns out my Mishnah Lechem was reprinted in the 1970s and does have Mishnah Lechem, but it does not have the Mishnah Lechem on Avos. It's in the Mishnah Lechem on Avos. Now, then I remembered why I had written down Rabbi Yaakov Emden. In his Lechem Shamayim on Avos, which is printed separately, He has a list in the beginning of Avos, listing out different Rashis on the Masechta, saying this is not this. L'mashal Avos, he says, is not from Rashi. Now, over there in the Hagdama of the Lechem Shamayim, doesn't say that. Now, this Hagdama, for some reason, was not printed in a lot of the editions of Lechem Shamayim of Rabbi Yaakov Emden. But in the first edition of the Lechem Shamayim of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, which this Chaim Michal had, there is actually a Mishnah Lechem on Avos, which has 15 pages, which is not printed in the 1970 edition. That is where I checked up. And I'm saying all this is the reason why you have to, is to explain why you have to justify Seforim, what I have behind me, and not just to rely on computer search engines and stuff. You see it, and a lot of times you could see the thing. What do I see? Is that in the Mishnah Lechem on Avos, Rabbi Yaakov Emden says, he says the following words: Ki pirish Gemara Taanis v'chein nedarim. Now, I have no idea how, but Chaim Michal chapt. And then it turns out not Chaim Michal chapt, also the Chida chapt this, because the Chida was before Chaim Michal, that Rabbi Yaakov Emden had a list, I said, in Lechem Shamayim, and he lists out different sectors. So he's adding in one word, that what? Taanit also is not from Rashi. But the problem is, that's only one word. It doesn't say why. Why in the world is it like that? So then I find that there is a thing, Rabbi Yaakov Emden wrote, so originally I was looking for this Rabbi Yaakov Emden, I thought maybe it was in his Haggais on Maseches Taanit. So if you use the Shas Vilna, we have Haggais of Rabbi Yaakov Emden on Gemara. But those are not complete. Vakshal, in one of the things to get people to buy a Shas, he put in different things. This before Eizvahadar took over. And he got a hold of the Ksav Yad of Rabbi Yaakov Emden on Gemara, in his Gemara in Oxford, called Kailan Shel Seforim, and he printed them throughout the Masechtas. Now, I'm not even sure if Vakshal is complete, but it's much more than what's in the standard back of the Gemaras of regular Masechtas. Okay, locate over there, and in Daf Yud. Okay, so over there he doesn't say that it's not Rashi. What does he say? He says on Daf Yud Ches, this is found if you use a Shas Vakshal. I'm not sure if it's in other editions I'm not sure if it's in the Eizvahadar, because I'm not sure if they got permission to use this Kailan Shel Seforim. Anyway, he says as follows: the Libi Omerli Shezeh Halashoin Eini Mepirish Rashi Ela Begilyon Hayakasov Bechnisu Hamatbisim B'Soicha Rashi. Then he says V'Zeh Davar Matzi Leroy V'Masechta Zu. So Rabbi Yaakov Emden, although he in the beginning of Avos, so first of all, the Chida never saw this Rabbi Yaakov Emden. This is from a manuscript of his Gemara in Oxford. But the Chida just takes it, okay, it's Rashi. It's not Rashi. Because of this word, I told you, I don't understand how the Chida, he put this, whatever, okay. You have to take into account the Chida is traveling a lot of the time. He's not sitting in front of a nice library, quiet. He remembers one word, puts it together. Okay, Chaim Michal at least, he's sitting in a beautiful library. He's a rich Gvir, so he was able to look. Anyway, bottom line is, he doesn't have it, but it says, so. But when you look over there, he's not saying it's not Rashi. He's saying there was stuff added in. Now, this is a more common occurrence, especially following the printing of the Talmud. A lot of Haggais were stupped into the various prints, especially already going back to Haggais of the Marshal was put in. So it didn't take. So it turns out Rabbi Yaakov Emden is not removing it from Rashi. Okay, but this is why it's important to see exactly what it is Rabbi Yaakov Emden said. However, moving a little further, Maritz Chayas prints Haggais on Shas in a Tfus Vin, I believe it was, and then later on in a journal called Tzion, and then later on he wrote a Tshuva Sefer, with the second part of the Tshuva Sefer has certain Mamarim of his, and he has a Maimer Simin in Imri Bina, Simin Hey. He has an extensive Arichos going through all of Rashi on Masechtas Taanit and asking various questions. And he sets it up very, very Masudar, going through the Masechta, pointing out different ha'aris. Now, these ha'aris are based on different things that he, from his knowledge of Rashi and Shas, and it's interesting is that no one really took this siman, although everyone quotes this siman, no one ever really took this siman and went through piece by piece to see, is this an issue? What do I mean to say? Is that from the time that Tzchayas wrote this till today, there's been a major our improvement in our understanding, even though we still don't understand completely how Rashi wrote his work, and there's many questions not answered, but we know much more than before. And the question would be to check if all these things still carry weight. Some of these things might not be issues so much, because let's say you have one list he has is Stiris and Rashi, and he even points to Lamashal and Magen Avram in Siman Taf Kuf Nun Daled that he says over there, the Magen Avram is being Ma'ira Stira in Rashi from Psachim to Taanis, but the Magen Avram doesn't say, it's not Rashi on Taanis as an answer. And even that, it turns out the Nazir Shimshon has an answer for the Magen Avram's problem, but so that couldn't be, you can't have a build-up Stiris. We know there's always Stiris in Rashi, and that's its own conversation. Anyway, but bottom line is that the Maseches concludes, interestingly enough, based on his various many rayas. So someone did attempt, we'll get to who in a second, someone did attempt to answer up some of them, but it still has a lot more, it could be improved much more. So the Maseches' conclusion is that it must be there was some version of Rashi on the Masechta, and a Talmud added stuff or someone else of that sort, and that's why there's more problems in this Masechta than other Masechtas. Okay, that's what the Maseches' conclusion is.
How about the Chida? You getting back to the Chida?
Okay, so the Chida, his conclusion, interestingly, is like this. He seems to go like with this Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Note, he doesn't have any rayas. He says, he had a kasha with a certain Rashi, whatever. Then he says, but Lamaisa, he saw the Taisus Rid, the Ritva, and Rabbeinu Betzalel and their Chedushim bring pieces from Rashi, and they're in this Rashi. So it must be, if they're being miyachas at the Rashi, it's Rashi, and mistakes crept into Rashi, which is more possible. Now, the Chidah was able to say such a thing because, you have to understand, in this period of time, we were talking about the late 1700s, the Chidah is writing this piece. This piece of the Chidah is being written in the 1780s, probably. There's virtually almost no Rishonim on Maseches Taanis. So no one could even tell you this proof. The Chidah, who traveled and visited many libraries, and we saw many manuscripts as he identifies them in his Magal Tov, fascinating book, he was able to say such a thing and say such a proof. Now, but a little further, Maseches, he doesn't talk about if other Rishonim, because again, still, the scene of Rishonim for this Masechta, which we're going to elaborate on shortly, is still almost dead. Now, okay, Now, so in short, I would suggest that even though the Maseches does make this conclusion and the Chidah has his thing, there's still work to be improved to prove one way or the other more conclusive. However, just to say a few things, just a few last points with this to conclude this piece about Rashi on this Masechta, I would like to conclude with a few things. First of all, a lot of people did accept this Maseches. Some quote him, some don't. You'll find, for example, Rabbi Ezra Altshuler, a famous Litvish Gaon, wrote on Me'ilah. He has a whole piece in the beginning of the Sefer about various Rashis on the Maseches. He right away says, but he doesn't quote Maseches, it's not Rashi. There's a very chashiv Galicianer, Dayan Rev Rappaport. He was a Talmud, possibly, of the Minchas Chinuch, but he brought the Minchas Chinuch to print. He has Hagoyis in this interesting Sefer, printed in the 1870s, called Ber Hagoyla. In the back of the Sefer, he has a bunch of Hagoyis on the Sefer. And he also, Kalachar Yad, Taanis, not Rashi. The Dikduke Seforim, who is expert in this type of thing, he says it's not Rashi, but in a few places, and he interestingly enough, in at least one place, he goes, the Gaon Maseches already was Machiach this in his tshuva, and it seems he's accepting that it's not Rashi. Again, I'm not going to go with the long list of all the people that talk about it as it's a long list, but one interesting tidbit to emphasize. Certain Gedolei Lita, they talk about it, both the brothers, the Marakain and the Cheshek Shleima, they refer to the Maseches. How do they refer to him? Similar to how the Dikduke Seforim, another Litvish person, they refer to him as Gaon. What does that mean? So I just like to point out, not to be ma'irich on this, but it's even a debate. A few weeks ago, even everyone always asks: Is the Maseches a maskal? He's not. He's good for the Jews, bad for the Jews, whatever you want. Interestingly enough, even in Satmar, a few weeks ago, I just got a call this week how this was being debated in various Satmar newspapers that come out for Shabbos in the past few weeks, specifically about this point. One guy quoted the Maseches and didn't give him proper cover. The other guy said, how can't you give cover? The next guy says, you could. The Satmar Rebbe quotes him, the whole thing. It's debated about always. I hold, my conclusion is that he's 100% Beseder, and I could bring many proofs to it. Here are some, is that the Gedolei Lita always refer to him as Gaon. They don't usually write Gaon so fast. Now, this whole approach of Maseches. He's in this simon. He's mamish going through Rashi very clearly. He's not just like, okay, it doesn't like the lashon, it doesn't fit. Where did he get this? Again, on the tip of just to give you a tiny piece of where it's coming from. I believe it's from the influence of his great Rabbi, the great Rabbi Ephraim Zal Margolis. I just have to say that to plug my work on Rabbi Ephraim Zal Margolis. I've worked on him extensively, and I feel that that's where the hashpah came. Rabbi Ephraim Zal Margolis was very into text-oriented, being Medayik and Rashi and Taisis Mamish, everything, and that's where it's coming from.
Where could people find your work on Rabbi Ephraim Zal Margolis?
One day when it gets printed. And the last point with all this is, why is this so significant? The answer is very simple. In Psak Halacha, a lot of times, when you learn Halacha, you will find that even though some people say you can't bring a raya from Rashi LaHalacha, many disagree with such a point. It's its own shmooze. And for example, the Magen Avram in Hilchos Shabbos has a piece where he built off a shita of his, built off a Rashi in Taanis. This is the same Magen Avram that knew about steers in Rashi, in Siman Tov Kuf Nun Dalet. And we find other places. Recently, there was a journal 2-3 years ago that came out, and someone has a whole interesting piece in the Geya relating to Halacha L'Maisa today, stuff that comes up in Maseches Taanit, and it plays out, do we count this as Rashi? If it's Rashi, the Rashi is one of the Gedolei Olam, so it's a heavyweight. If it's a Talmud, and it's mistakes, and it's this, people will be more skeptical. Do you count them in the list, etc.? Okay, that's the significance why it is. Anyway, so I'm not being machriya. A lot of people say a lot of different things. That's what I like to confuse you, and that's the end of the story of Rashi on Maseches Taanit.
And the Maratchias, we must say that Rebbitzin Bruria David, Hutner's daughter, famed Rebbitzin at BJJ, she wrote a dissertation on the Maratchias.
Correct. I am arguing on Rebbitzin Bruria David, and we don't want to go further because we do not want people to ban the show.
And Rabbi Dr. David Katz has a podcast on his Charedi Maskilim. Maratchias is on the list. Okay. I don't mean in a bad way, but this discussion. Very good. Okay, let's move forward. Okay. So Eliezer, let's move forward. You briefly touched upon the fact that Rishonim were not available on Taanis, certainly in the late 1700s. So when did they become available, and what do we have today?
Okay, so just to make it very quick, not barichos. So the first time really a significant Rishon comes to light is in 1729, is the Ritva. But interestingly, where most of the time the Ritva is written as a parish on the Gemara, here it's more on the Rif, and it's printed. But in 1729 afterwards, it wasn't really used. It takes a long time till it gets. But today, Baruch Hashem, we have Meiser of Cook, and it can be found in any shul library, a thorough work on the Masechta. Now, after that, there's no real significant development of Rishonim being available on the Masechta until comes along Shas Vilna. They were looking to pump their Shas, so they got a hold of Rabbeinu Chananel, the manuscript, and Rabbeinu Gershom. Without getting into anything about them, but these are important about what they are and the significance of their works. They're very important. They're on the daf, very useful. So already Shas Vilna and then the Ritva, you already have something. Fast forward a little bit later. Discoveries are made of this Rabbeinu Eliakim, which we spoke about by Masechtas Yuma, I believe, Masechtas Rabbeinu Eliakim. So they found a few blot of his. More recently, someone found a few more blot of Rabbeinu Eliakim. It's been printed in a journal called Chitzigi Peirushim. And of more recent, I was in contact with the author. He has found even more material of Rabbi Eliakim, which some of it is available on the internet for free on a website called All Torah, a very fascinating website, but it's not completely edited yet. It's a work in progress. But he put out some more blot of this Rabbi Eliakim. Just in short, significance of Rabbi Eliakim is it's a similar type style to Rashi type, so it's a very pshat-oriented sefer. Okay, and then just as always, there's always discovery. So there's a sefer Tzroiris was printed. A Nemuki Yosef and the Talmud of the Ramban on the Masechta were printed. A Ginzei Rishonim, which has a few more volumes. You have the Meiri, and that's some of the Rishonim that exist on the Masechta.
Okay, moving from Rishonim. Earlier Achreinim, I'm sure there are a lot of the standards, so I'll talk about a little bit of the standard ones and something that might be interesting, specifically the Masechtas Taanit.
So interestingly, again, there's not all that many Seforim on devoted to Maseches Taanis. We'll get to it shortly. And through that, I'll get to talking just one last point relating to Rashi on Taanis. But the first thing is that there's a famous achron, famous for people in the yeshiva world that learned Kachim, the Keren Oira. The Keren Oira is the brother of the famous Litvish Gadol, Mishkenes Yaakov. Now, for some reason, we know almost nothing about the Keren Oira, which is very interesting. He's assumed to be a Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhiner, but I can't find any such thing that he's a Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. His brother, the Mishkenes Yaakov, was a Talmud, possibly a Talmud Chaver of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. The sons of the Keren Oira write all about their father, a nice Hagdama, which I'm going to quote in a minute, one piece from it. They don't mention anything, and they would, that to say he also was a Talmud of Chaim Volozhiner. They don't point this out at all, so I suspect he was not a Talmud. He's strictly a Talmud of his brother. He's a few years younger than his brother, Mishkenes Yaakov. Now, it's clear from his looking at his work very quickly, he's influenced by the Gra style learning. He quotes the Gra very often, and he does quote something not so ordinary, but for someone in the influence of the Gra, the Yerushalmi. And another thing is he worked on Kachim, so that's where he's famous from. And just one thing about him, because I just found it so interesting, is the Hagdama. The children write about him. He basically, most of his life, he just sat and learned. Only Seif Yamav, after his brother died, he ends up taking over his brother's position, but he was living in this, at the end, he was living in the same city as his brother, and he learned with his brother. Anyway, so they describe their father's Seder Hayom. So they say that in the morning he would learn Mishnayos. He had a set Seder and Mishnayos. After first learning Zoya, this was early morning. Then he would, after davening, stay in Talis and Tefillin learning in Shul. A Daf Gemara. He gave some type of shir. And he would return to his room. Now remember, he's a Litvak. And as I said, I think he's influenced from the Gra camp, but he wore Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, which is a Chiddush, till about half the day. Then, and he was Isaac a lot in writing. Now, one last thing is after Mincha, he learned Tanakh, which again, this is why I assume he's somewhat influenced from the Gra / Reb Chaim Volozhiner. This was a limud not commonly found, especially not in those days. Okay, that's the Hagdama. This is the Keren Oira. Now, looking through the Sefer, something's very strange. His chashuva relative of his is the Shargas Aryeh. That's one of the famous yichos they even mentioned in this Hagdama, and his whole yichos is its own parsha, which we will not go into. A fascinating, interesting material. His Zayda was a Baruch Shik. Anyway, without going into the story of Baruch Shik, but he doesn't quote the next chashuva famous Achron that wrote on Maseches Taanis. Who's that? The Gvuras Ari, which I already spoke about by Yuma, and I spoke about by Rosh Hashanah. This was what's pshat? Answer is, this is where you got to know bibliography. And what's the answer to the question? The Gvuras Ari is printed after the Keren Oira. Keren Oira is printed in 1851. Gvuras Ari on Maseches Taanis is only printed in 1862. Therefore, he could not quote it. Okay. Now, we already were Meirich on the Gvuras Ari, so I'm not going to be Meirich a lot about him. I just want to say two tiny quotes. I was saying
that... Does the Gvuras Ari quote the Keren Oira?
No, because the Gvuras Ari is long dead. He was nifter way before. His son put it out, 1862, whereas the Shargas Aryeh was nifter in the 1790s.
See, I don't know bibliography.
It's not your fault. Baruch Hashem, you don't know. That's what you have to say. Baruch Hashem, I don't know bibliography. Anyway, just to quote two quotes about the Gvuras Ari, because we already were Meirich on him, and I was emphasizing then that people in the Gra camp for sure were into him, even though there's a line that the Gra said about him, different things. One such line I have recently discovered. What? Yeah.
Kesser, right? That's what you mentioned last time.
Yeah. With Pilpul, yeah, that he was two marba and Pilpul. But anyway, the Reb Menashe Me'ilya says, Kadmani bezeh hagoin bal Turiev and Rosh Hashanah. Who's Reb Menashe Me'ilya? One of the people from influenced by the Gra, who knew the Gra. What extent of a Talmud he is a different story. Another person from the Beis Medrash of a Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhiner and a Talmud Muvak of the Nachos David, a Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhiner, says, in Taanis, when he's talking about he has a shtickle Torah, he says, "Ma godlo simchasi she'achar zman rav nitba sefer Gvuras Ari me Rabbeinu goin hagaonim bal Shargas Aryeh." So in the all I'm just saying, it's not any chedushim. Some people were asking what am I meant. I'm not going to be myrich about it. But anyway, that's the point. There's a Gvur Sari, there's a Kerenar. That's the literature camp. What about the Galicianer Peirush camp? So, interestingly enough, there's a Rabbi Yaakov Shor. This was originally printed in the now doesn't exist sadly anymore, a journal from Babiv Chasidus Kerem Shleima. So there's a few pages of this great guy in Rabbi Yaakov Shor who has Arichas Yom. He dies in the 1920s. He was a Talmud by the Shalom Meshiv as a young kid already. Fascinating, interesting personality. Now, Lakewood printed a volume on Masechtas, Taanis, and other Maseches called, I think it's called Tehillah L'Yayin or something like that. And there they have this Rabbi Yaakov Shor. Somehow they have more pages than the Kerem Shleima. But they don't say exactly where they got it from, but it appears to me that they have a few more pages, so you even have some more pages of some nice Torah from Rabbi Yaakov Shor if you want a different style learning on the Masechta. Okay, now one last thing we always have on Masechta is that you always have to find someone who's Meshuggah to Eisa Masechta, which is an amazing thing, and we do find such a thing randomly walking into a Seforim store. One day I come across a sefer called Shitas Kadmonius al Masechtas Taanis. Okay, people complain that I don't show and tell, so here is how it looks. It's a giant sefer, nice size sefer. It was printed in Eretz Yisrael in Tafshin Samach Zayin. And this sefer, the fellow went ahead and he printed a lot of different svarim that he tracked down, chashiv svarim on Masechtas Taanis, including the Sefer Tzroirus that I mentioned was a Rishon. He got Rishus from the previous person who printed it, and a few other interesting Peirushim, and it's an amazing thing to have. It's mamash of Be'iyun Dika, there's a lot of material on Masechtas Taanis that one could find in this Sefer. Now, and one thing at the end is that he has a whole Sefer from someone, it's called Duktuke Chaverim, and this Sefer Duktuke Chaverim was first printed in 1803. Mamish, we're talking about a 200-page small print letters, but he did a nice job. Based on Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Seifer's recommendation to him to print this Sefer, it seems to be a very, very chashuv, thorough, be'iyun dika pirush on the Masechta. And one last thing he has in the Sefer, after printing over 8 Svarim Achreinim, he also went and he tracked down a bunch of Svarim that have a few pages on the Masechta, and he put it kilu like he calls it a Yalkut Mefarshim, which is very, very useful. A lot of times he printed this in Tafshin Samach Zayin, so Eitzar Chachma, especially with new technology that Eitzar Chachma has, the Sefer is not as today you could do such a thing yourself really, but it's still very good to have it. You need it for Shabbos, right? That's the claim why you have to buy Svarim still, and it's a very, very useful sefer. Now, when I say Meshuggah for the Masechta, it seems is that earlier, randomly walking into a Seforim store, I found myself seeing the sefer. It says on it, Rashi on Taanis. I'm like, Rashi on Taanis? Whatever. So this came out actually in Tafshin Samach Daled, and he located what he believes to be at least 2 blot, which is Vadei Rashi, and he deals with it in this sefer. So 2 blot, he claims, and it's not only him, other people agree with him that we have on some ancient print that he tracked down through Mechon Talmud Israeli, and he printed these 2 blot of Rashi. That's for sure Rashi. He also deals with, I mentioned the Meretz Chai as someone dealing with it. He deals with it in the Sefer, but I think it's not enough. But be that as it may, you always need such a person. The reason why it's significant to have these type of people is they take a Masechta, they adapt a Masechta, and then you're able to learn it, and you could have valuable information on the Masechta. Now, just to conclude, so that's the main street, I guess, Achrayim on the Masechta.
Achrayim. Yes, we want to discuss. We're running out of time. Any contemporary Achrayim you want to mention, or you mentioned?
Right, exactly. Well, just because the clock is ticking, so people complain I don't mention enough more contemporary. So there's a sefer called Igra de Taanisa, which is from a fellow Rabbi Nachum Abrams in Muncie. It's over 500 pages. Igra de Taanisa is available for download on Hebrew Books. Very thorough sefer, malaket, a lot of material on the Masechta. And then I got an email a few days ago, a sefer Hatzivi Tziyunim. Someone in Bnei Brak put out blot by blot a lot of marmakaimis and pieces, pshat oriented, but a very nice work of 100-something pages on the Masechta. That's the Masechta. Just to end off, is this Masechta talks about
you mentioned also
kindness,
before,
as I mentioned.
You also mentioned before the Tehillah L'Yayin, right?
Right. So Tilu Yaina is a collection of more contemporary Rosh Hashivas also on the Masechta from all types. Malakit, some they got some manuscripts, a very nice collection of material on the Masechta. Put out by people in Lakewood, some form of chon. I don't know if it still exists, but they put out more than one Masechta. Okay, just to conclude, is Masechtas Taanis, Halacha L'Maisa is about Taanis. What are the sugyas, interestingly, so first in general, Taanit, some recent sefer came out, Likut, just people like these type of things, called Nesive HaMinhagim from Rav Dvorkis. This is about Taanit Hatzibur V'Hayachid. In the back it has a, but he just basically lists all the Taanesim that there are, and he has some nice material about it. Okay. And he has in the back on Hilchas Taanit a small kuntres from manuscript of Rav Shrei Dublitsky. Now, just to conclude, speaking of Rav Shrei Dublitsky was a guy nifter in his late 90s in Eretz Yisrael a few years ago. He was famous for writing Seforim on Noisim, on topics that no one else wrote about. Sometimes he would find the Simon and Shulchan Aruch that for some reason wasn't. So one such topic that he wrote about is the concept of Taanit. This Masechtas Taanit, as Daf Yomi people already know, deals with, or people learn Mishnayos Taanit, that it deals with fasting because of lack of rain. So now in Eretz Yisrael, sometimes this happens. It starts raining very late, so you're supposed to make a Taanit. So he wants to know why we don't do it. So he wrote a whole sefer about it. It was printed 4 times. It's called Palgei Mayim. Okay, very nice sefer in his style. Just to conclude, so he sent the sefer out to different gedolim. He got feedback. Some gedolim liked it. So interesting, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach writes to him, the reason is today, it could be that today it's not as negeya to do this. His point always is, it should be we should fast, because that's what's straight in halacha, and he goes through the whole sugya from scratch, and malakad everything, any fascinating material in the sefer. So Rav Shlomo Zalman said, that's very possible, because a fast, who's going to end up fasting? The Bnei Yeshiva. And because no one else is going to take it so seriously. So for Bnei Torah, it's better they shouldn't fast. So, and what do we rely on? So we rely on the Maisa food could come where it's a whole different world than 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So it's, even though, yes, rain is important, it's not as important, not as dangerous, definitely. So yes, you'll find 100 years, 200 years ago, people did fast and Gedolim held to fast, but not so much as today. You could, Rosh Zalman was saying in this letter they print in one of the editions, that one could be makel about it. Anyway, that's some of the Seforim on the Masechta Taanis that are out there.
Okay, sounds fascinating. There are so many things you mentioned that we could have conversations on standalone, but not in this forum. Amir Hashem, we'll get to them, and looking forward to next Masechta.
One day.
And Mishnah is coming up. You mentioned the Karanoira. Also learned Mishnah is interesting piece of information. And thank you again, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brodt, and we will be in touch.